commemorating the past, reflecting on the present, envisioning a future. 1962.
Mother of men and ruler of the world raises her noble head and approaches the court of justice with the clarion call for equal rights for Bahamian women.
Our right to vote and our right to hold office should never be taken lightly and should be exercised at every opportunity.
True, we women are ready, willing, and able. You must no longer deny us our rights.
Thank you. I'd now like to call on Dr. Marjorie Brooks-Jones, Dean of the Faculty of Liberal and Fine Arts and Acting Dean of Social Sciences of the College of the Bahamas, to bring welcoming remarks.
Your Excellency, Sir Arthur and Lady Folks, Mrs. Elma Garraway, Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Education, Mrs. Barbara Burrows, Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Labour, Mrs. Camille Johnson, Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Health, Mrs. Vinette Graham-Allen, Director of Public Prosecutions, Ms. Catherine Stewart-Gibson, Public Affairs, U.S. Embassy, Ms. Ruth Bo-Darville, President, the Bahamas Bar Association, representatives from the Attorney General's Office, Ministry of Labour, Departments of Social Services, Rehabilitative Welfare Services, and non-governmental women's organizations, members of the National Women's Advisory Council, members of the College of the Bahamas Council, Mrs. Jennifer Isaacs-Dotson, President, National Congress of Trade Unions of the Bahamas, Mrs. Tonya Bastian-Galanis, Principal, Eugene DePuge Law School, senior administration, faculty, staff, and students, the College of the Bahamas, everyone. Welcome. 4 years ago, in February 2008, the College of the Bahamas commemorated the abolition of the British slave trade by hosting a conference. Its full name was The Abolition of the British Transatlantic Slave Trade, Telling the Story. Scholars, local and international, and members of the wider Bahamian community were invited to submit papers on a range of topics such as language and oppression, religion in slavery, identity, culture, race, and gender, and enslavement and liberation, a pedagogy. The conference proved enormously successful. However, perhaps more relevant is the fact that it reminded us of our history and of the continuing need to teach that history to all Bahamians, particularly the younger Bahamians among us. But the history imperative cannot be confined, as was the case previously, to the memorizing and regurgitation of dates produced chronologically. The history narrative today is much, much more. It tells the story, his and her stories, of those who have gone before, who have fought for the right to live their lives free from discrimination, from the often brutal imposition of an inequality based on differences of race, place of origin, political opinions, religion or belief, sex, and gender. Telling the story is what the word history signifies. It is what the School of Social Sciences does and does well. It did that when it organized the Abolition Conference in 2008, and again last fall when it hosted the Violence Symposium. During that academic forum, we were exposed to a multiplicity of research findings and statistics on crime and criminals, and to stories, inmate stories, newspaper stories, and the representations of violence contained in them, and the stories of those against whom violence in a myriad of forms is committed while attending junk canoe. Research and scholarship thus conjoin with stories to revision the past, examine the present, and envision the future. This symposium, the Women's Suffrage Symposium, continues the work of the School of Social Sciences in Research and Scholarship and telling the story. Along with its collegial partner, the School of English Studies, its co-sponsor, the Bureau of Women's Affairs, and in particular Ms. Christine Campbell, First Assistant Secretary, who has made such a contribution to this important event. The School of Social Sciences merits our congratulations and gratitude. I wish specifically to acknowledge the school chair, Mr. Stephen Arna, for his support of this undertaking, the Women's Suffrage Symposium Committee Chair, Dr. Christopher Curry, who has worked indefatigably to make his concept a reality, and Dr. Ian Bethel Bennett of the School of English Studies, who has special responsibility for Friday's program. One may, after such acknowledgement, be tempted to remark on the fact that of the 4 persons identified, 3 are men. That is undeniable. Men, too, have a part in the telling of the story of the women's suffrage movement in the Bahamas. But the story we are about to hear, discuss, and analyze is primarily that of a movement undergirded by Bahamian women who courageously and unreservedly fought for the right to vote, and thereby influence the way we live our lives and shape our society and our country. Each of us owes them an immeasurable debt, for they taught us all the power of words to effect change, of the power inherent in the telling of the story. Ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to invite the committee chair, Dr. Christopher Curry, to tell us more. Thank you very much.
With protocol having been established, I will simply say, welcome everyone. The Women's Suffrage Movement Symposium has provided a wonderful opportunity for cross-fertilization between faculty and staff at COB, the Bureau of Women's Affairs, and other individuals from within the larger Bahamian community. This symposium offers an opportunity to critically reflect on the legacy of the women's suffrage movement while also addressing unresolved issues of gender inequality that still exist in the Bahamas today. The theme of the symposium reflects this idea: commemorating the past, reflecting on the present, envisioning a future, 1962 and beyond. Clearly, while we begin by commemorating the monumental achievements of the suffrage movement and the right to vote in 1962, this symposium requires us to think more deeply about the challenges that have emerged beyond the era of the Quiet Revolution. This challenge if taken seriously, will lead us to think about how we can remove existing barriers of gender discrimination and inequality, with the end result, I believe, being a deepening of democracy in the Bahamas. Over the course of the next few days, you will hear from a number of panelists who will speak on a wide range of topics related to the women's suffrage movement and gender equality. Beginning in the past, this evening's session is intended to highlight the legacy of the movement. Our panelists will offer a historical perspective on the movement, its deep roots, while also reflecting on its unattained goals. On Wednesday night, we shift to more pressing contemporary issues, engaging the topic of gender equality in the Bahamas. Panelists will speak on issues such as domestic violence, the underperformance of males in our educational system, and gender and national identity. On Thursday night, we aim to look more futuristically under the theme of tools for transformations. Speakers will address gender discourses and suggest ways that we can change the legal and social context in which gender issues emerge. Our Friday sessions will move beyond the nation and explore Caribbean masculinities. A number of prominent scholars from within the Caribbean region will be featured in the Friday panel sessions running from 9 a.m. till 4 p.m. I would be remiss if I did not mention at this point that in the audience today, we have, in my estimation, the last surviving living legend of the suffrage movement in Mrs. June Stevenson. Would you please stand? I continue. In general, it is worth noting that in planning the symposium, the committee has sought to include multiple voices, academics and noted scholars from within the Bahamas and the region, cultural activists, but, and this is most important, we've included students. Ultimately, if this symposium is to function as planned, it will lend itself to raising the awareness of an important moment in Bahamian history, as well as engender thoughtful reflection on the way forward as it relates to gender relations. Welcome and enjoy the symposium.
Applications to the Colonial Office and to the government of the day, the women's suffrage movement sought to make a plea before the Parliament of the House of Assembly in Nassau, Bahamas, on January 19th, 1959. So Dame Dr. Doris Johnson and a group of suffragists went before Parliament and attempted to have the speech read there on behalf of women. They were denied that, as there was considered to be no precedent for women to give a speech before Parliament. As it may be, the Parliament retired to a magistrate's court next door, under Maxwell Thompson, and it was there that Dame Dr. Doris Johnson, along with her colleagues, she gave this pivotal speech to the parliamentarians on behalf of the right to vote for women. And we in the committee thought that no school child from this day on should ever not know this speech, and that across the breadth and length of the Bahamas, we all should know this speech that was given. It was a turning point in the suffrage movement and one that helped us to gain the right to vote. And so we sought to dramatize this entire speech for you tonight. And I call on Dr. Darlene D. Roll Cargill, School of Social Sciences, to do that. Welcome, Carlene.
Mr. Speaker, and members of the Honorable House of Assembly, today, invincible womanhood, mother of men and ruler of the world, raises her noble head and approaches the court of justice with the clarion call for equal rights for Bahamian women. Mr. Speaker, and members of the Honorable House of Assembly, the women's suffragette movement speaks today on behalf of 54,000 women, more than one half of the adult population of our islands. The women of the Bahamas have been awakened to their responsibilities and duties as citizens for many generations. And in the last 30 and 35 years, women have vigorously carried out their duties and responsibilities in a manner comparable to those of women in any highly civilized country. True, we have not been violent agitators because we have accepted the traditional theory that civic and political responsibilities were ably carried out by our men. Today, women have, by force of circumstance, taken on increasing responsibilities to ensure the proper development and growth of our homes, our children, and our social institutions. Bahamian women have risen to give outstanding leadership services in business activities, welfare work, home and school organizations, as well as the extension of brotherly love to 100 fraternal, friendly societies throughout these islands. In nearly all of these organizations, women have already learned how to use democratic techniques of government and the principles of choosing their representatives. We nominate and elect officers and keenly watch their service to the group, returning them again to leadership when they have served us well. We know of the many selfish intrigues which sometimes motivate men and women to seek re-election and election. And we are aware of our responsibility to rid the group of corrupt and improper leadership once the welfare of the group is threatened. We have therefore learned to choose our leaders well and wisely. The same principle will guide us now as we seek to assume our duties and responsibilities in guiding the destiny of our beloved islands. An early petition for women's suffrage was presented in 1952 by the Great Benevolent Order of Elks of the World, an organization with membership of over 10,000 and with 6 temples in the Out Island. We regret that the petition submitted to the House on the 1st of December 1958 was grossly misrepresented as coming from 13 petitioners and 529 others. The 45-page petition, photostatic copies of which have been preserved, was signed by 2,829 persons living widely scattered in the islands of Exuma, Grand Bahama, Abaco, Long Island, Cat Island, Eleuthera, Andros, and New Providence. We wish to go on record in protesting to the House that a great justice has been done to the people's cause, and this rash, irresponsible deed can only be vindicated by women as one of the greatest crimes against their faithful trust. Faithfulness is the basic principle upon which we build our homes, rear our children, and build our nation. We women have accepted and paid all taxes which are imposed upon us by a government in which we now have no representations. Since we are powerless to limit these taxes, we are forced to bring charges of tyranny and despotism against this our government, if it further denies us the right to choose those who must rule over us and share in the making of our laws. Should the government agree to abolishing all taxes of every kind, including stamp duties and custom duties on goods and properties owned by women, we would regard this as detrimental to the progress of our country. But mind you, we would be justified in refusing to pay our taxes since we women are ineligible to vote. We do not wish to be regarded as rebellious, but we would point out to you that to cling sullenly and timidly to ancient, outmoded ways of government is not in the best interest of our country. We therefore earnestly desire that this regime go on record as an enlightened, democratic body by ordering the immediate enumeration and registration of all women 21 years and over so that they may carry out their duties as full citizens in the next by-election or general election. We women press this demand and ask such enactment on the basis of not who is right, but what is right for our country. We judge expediency only on this basis. We seek no compromise. There is no alternative, and we abhor any delay. We women ask only that you gentlemen move now to secure the rights of 54,000 women, including your wives and daughters. Approximately half of the female population are working women, many of whom are the entire support for their families. Many have built their own homes, have bank accounts, established themselves in business and paying taxes. An early petition points out to the Honorable House that it is a violation of the principles of democracy to grid out taxes from people who are without the power to limit or extend such taxes. Taxation without representation, as you will recall, was the basic principle upon which the American Revolution was based, and which, due to the short-sightedness of the British King George III and his ministers, lost for Britain our great and beneficent neighbor, the United States of America. It is this principle which still stirs a revolt in the heart of Bahamian women and energizes us to make our plea before honorable men. We women grieve and are deeply concerned when our sons and daughters, tried in the court of law, find always that they are faced by a male group of jurors. We do firmly believe that it is democratic and right that women should serve on these juries. But without the vote, the whole country is denied the benefit of full and impartial judgment. We women are extremely concerned that the plight of delinquent girls is taken so lightly by our government. The heart of mothers grieve at the revolting practice of sending poor girls 8, 9, 10, and 11 years to jail with seasoned criminals. Active participation in government by Bahamian women will see an end to such practices, and proper care and guidance will be given to those whose real crime is only poverty and insecurity. There are other grievances, and we women have. Local government in our islands is administered to boards and committees. There are 11 boards consisting of 56 members. There are 21 committees assisted by advisory committee, and on these there are 7 women who are privileged to serve only in inferior capacities. There are nearly 200 justices of the peace, from whose rank women are totally excluded. There are out-island commissionerships, to which no woman is invited to serve. The Hawthorne Report on Education suggests to the government the advisability of including women on the proposed advisory committee to the Board of Education. While wholeheartedly endorsing this suggestion, we further wish to show the advisability of including women on the Board of Education and any other board which deals with the welfare of our home, our schools, and communities. Gentlemen, hear me. It requires the insight and interest of women to investigate, report on, and seek improvement of many projects in which men are not naturally interested and which would free you to turn your energies to more manly pursuits. We women wish to serve our country and assist your efforts in attending to such projects as housing scheme, slum clearance, establishments of libraries and museums, local welfare services, supervision of food and drug supplies, and the establishment of reasonable and respectable lodging for temporary visitors from our out islands, education, in the processing and operation of school medical services and milk distribution, care for our many weed-covered cemeteries, registration of births and deaths and marriages, proper filing system of registration of voters, the suppression of nuances, maternity and child care, jury service notification, and disinfection of infectious diseases, care for the elderly. These are only a few of the areas in which women can make their contribution. This is a task so large that it would take the energies of everybody, men, women, to better conditions of our islands. Mr. Speaker and members of the Assembly, putting aside our grievances, we women raise our hearts and heads to loftier things, our willingness and readiness to participate as full citizens in the affairs of our country. We women are ready, willing, and able. You must no longer deny us our rights. Your humble petitioner thanks God for this opportunity to speak to your hearts and consciousness, and prays that speedy action will be taken by you to bring about the enumeration and registration of all Bahamian women 21 years and over. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cargill-Rowe. From that speech, you get a really good idea of the wide-ranging concerns of the women's suffrage movement, wider than the right to vote. There were so many social concerns of the day that the women were concerned about. And if we look at the legacy and the journey from 1962 to now, we can see that many of those concerns have been addressed and can continue to be addressed by women's groups and the country at large. Again, I cannot stress my feeling that we all should really embrace that speech and hold it very dear as one of our national speeches.
We are indeed grateful to those visionary, strong women, Mary Ingram, Mabel Walker, Georgiana Simonet, Eugenia Lockett, and Doris Johnson, who led the movement for change, supported by other women, and indeed some men. I can remember when my mother voted for the first time, and she was so proud when she came home and she waved that card and she said to us, "I voted today." So it was truly a life-changing experience in our women, and we are certainly proud of those women who led the way, who championed the cause, so that all of us are able to enjoy that right. This evening, so far, we have been treated to a wonderful synopsis of a documentary that is to come, and we certainly look forward to the finished product. Those of you who had the opportunity to attend the session this morning, or perhaps listened to it on Radio Bahamas, should have been greatly touched by the reflections shared particularly by the relatives of the women who led the movement. And on Minister's behalf, I wish to thank the College of the Bahamas and the Bureau of Women's Affairs for organizing this event. It certainly promises to be a wonderful educational event, and I do trust that the entire process will be recorded so that we can share it with students and we can share it with generations of Bahamians to come. So again, on Minister's behalf, I congratulate and thank the College of the Bahamas, the Bureau of Women's Affairs, and all of the persons who will participate in this symposium over the next 3 days. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Your Excellencies, Dame Marguerite, colleague, permanent secretaries, and other senior civil servants, council and faculty of the College of the Bahamas, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a privilege for me to bring greetings on behalf of the Minister of Education, the Honorable T. Desmond Bannister on this occasion. I'm personally honored as a woman to stand here at such a time in our history and speak to you on such an important topic, the 50th anniversary of the women's suffrage movement in the Bahamas. I must commend the College of the Bahamas for partnering with the Women's Affairs Bureau of the Ministry of Social Development to stage this 4-day symposium, which highlights and promotes discussion on this significant era in our history. The Minister of Education is unable to be here and sends his apologies, but he is also pleased that this event will reach thousands of citizens, particularly our students in New Providence, in Grand Bahama, and in the Family Islands by broadcast on radio. And I simply trust that the print media will also do their part in educating our people on the movement which fought for and achieved the rights of women to vote. It is important for us, ladies and gentlemen, to recognize the achievement of these brave women of whom we have heard so much this evening. These heroines set a course to win the right for women to vote, and their determination made the difference. 50 years later, we, the women of the Bahamas, are still exercising this constitutional right for which these women fought so hard. Let me applaud the work of all those who have contributed to this body of knowledge. And particularly, I am told of the work this morning of the children of these women who agreed to participate in this forum, affording us an intimate look into the movement. Oftentimes, you see, ladies and gentlemen, we do not appreciate that children of political heroes and heroines often have their parents taken away from them because of the nature of the work in which parents are engaged. We are fortunate that many of them have followed in their parents' footsteps, and they too have become nationalists and made major contributions to our development as an independent nation. I also hope that the experiences that they share with us will be able to clarify and record for posterity the truth as far as this important era in our history is concerned. We in the Ministry of Education appreciate the fact that this opportunity will expose many of our social studies teachers to this important topic and enable them to convey the material to their students with the zeal that it should be taught. It is through teaching that we enable this topic to become prominent as the discovery of our country, majority rule, and the independence of the Bahamas. And finally, I trust that the discussions and the information emanating from this forum will be recorded and disseminated and discussed long after this symposium is over. I know that this institution, the College of the Bahamas, and indeed the School of Social Sciences, have already conceived ways to keep this subject in the public domain, and for that I congratulate them and thank them on behalf of the Bahamian people and indeed the students of our nation. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Good evening again. On November 26, 1962, thousands of women in New Providence and the Family Islands exercised their right to vote for the first time in Bahamian history. According to the parliamentary registrar at the time, Maxwell Thompson, there were 28,244 persons eligible to vote in New Providence and 16,678 in the Out Islands. Most insightful was the registrar's statement that in New Providence, 19,126 persons might be voting for the first time and 10,523 for the first time in the Out Islands. Apart from these statistics, Thompson had earlier released a press statement on July 14th where he indicated that approximately 2,000 women had registered to vote since July 2nd. Taken together, these figures illustrate the tenacious ways in which many women across the length and breadth of the archipelago had mobilized their efforts to exercise their right to vote in the general election of 1962. Yet it would be overly simplistic and a disservice to the history of the suffrage movement to focus solely on the narrow outcome of the struggle as expressed by women voting for the first time in this election. Indeed, the struggle that in many ways culminated with the right to vote in 1962 had very deep roots on two fronts. First, in terms of chronology and scope, the movement reflected decades of agitation that emerged in the late 19th century, but expanded and gained greater momentum in the immediate post-World War II environment of the 1940s and 50s. Using this broader historical trajectory, I contend that many of the leading suffragists acquired valuable leadership training, organizational skills, and political acumen in proto-political organizations such as churches, lodges, friendly societies, long before the emergence of a formal suffrage movement in the 1950s. Second, the women's suffrage movement emerging in these decades was also deeply rooted in the sense that they were not simply agitating for the narrowly confined right to vote. Rather, this movement was far more expansive in its objectives. It was focused on natural rights, including citizenship and gender equality, with the ultimate goal of dismantling barriers of exclusion that obstructed women from their full participation in the civic affairs of the colony. Now, before examining the antecedents of the movement, it is necessary to unpack another misunderstanding about the suffrage movement that has dominated the historiography and popular perceptions about the struggle. The suffrage movement was far from monolithic. Though the leading suffragist ladies were educated, active lodge members, and enjoyed an elevated status as part of a growing black and brown middle class, many were divided along political lines. Mary Ingram was a strong supporter of the UBP. Eugenia Lockhart was the president of the ladies' branch of the PLP. Beyond these differences, there were actually two branches to the suffrage movement in the Bahamas. They cross-fertilized each other and merged at pivotal times to speak with one voice. Several of the key women belonged to both arms of the movement. Mary Ingram was elected as president of the suffrage movement in 1957. Georgiana Simonet was the vice president, and Eugenia Lockhart was the treasurer. Given these complexities, I argue that the multi-layered nature of the women's suffrage movement was birthed in the political and social unrest of the late 19th and early 20th century Bahamas, gaining support from international movements and intellectual currents outside of the Bahamas. These forces combined to ultimately engender an organizational system that advanced broad-ranging political rights for women in the Bahamas. The political awakening of women in the Bahamas began with their participation in church societies and secular organizations such as lodges and burial societies in the mid to late 19th century. Lodges and fraternal organizations, in fact, existed in the Bahamas since the late 18th century, when a lodge was established in the city of Nassau under the Grand Lodge of England. After 1834, in the immediate post-emancipation period, they expanded and developed in a society marked by the continuation of virulent racial prejudice. Gail Saunders notes that the Grantstown and Eastern Friendly Societies were established as early as 1834. These institutions not only provided a link to African-derived practices, but in more tangible ways assisted members through sick benefits as a form of insurance that would have been otherwise denied to blacks by Bay Street merchants. From the 1870s, friendly societies and lodges grew rapidly and played an important role in the economic and social life of black men and women. According to Simeon Bowe, the lodges became a venue of communication for black men as a result of racial discrimination they faced in Bahamian society. As Bowe further argues, lodges provided a proper forum for the black man, the training ground for most blacks in public life, especially those that went into politics and business. More importantly, Bowe notes that it was in these meetings that blacks were able to learn and practice parliamentary procedures that equipped them for the role they were to play on the political stage, as they learned the art of debating, preparing motions and counter motions. Even as lodges tended to be dominated by free black and colored men, there were also auxiliary branches created exclusively for women, where they received an embryonic training in politics that would later be transferred to the mobilization of the suffrage movement in the 1940s and 50s. Arguably, moving beyond the traditional ideas about politics as simply voting or holding political office provides a more fruitful way of understanding the antecedents of the suffrage movement. As such, I use the meaning of politics to include both the personal and collective resistance to white hegemony, a kind of practice, a kind of praxis exercised in the shadow of a society dominated by a white mercantile elite. In this context, many blacks were forced to find creative and adaptive ways to practice politics outside of the halls of the House of Assembly. Their politics was personal, exercised and enacted in the streets, nightclubs, and lodges over the hill. Despite